Elder Tony had given Omu everything a village could ask for: harvests that defied dry seasons, children who recovered from fevers that had no business releasing them, old men who walked away from his porch carrying years they hadn't arrived with. He had dispensed grace like a man with an inexhaustible supply. But grace, as Tony knew better than anyone alive, was never inexhaustible. It was only ever redirected, and the place it had been redirected from, for 50 years, was the body of the man sitting in the wooden chair on the porch, watching the line stretch back to the tree lane, his clouded eyes weeping not from sorrow but from the particular physical erosion of a man who has been quietly paying someone else's bill for half a century. He was not a healer. He was a ledger. And the ledger was almost full. The story opens at first light in the village of Omu, in the amber hour when the baobab trees stand copper against the sky and the mist over the lower fields hasn't burned off yet, the hour when the sick decide they are sick enough to make the walk. Elder Tony sits in his chair as he has sat in it every morning for 5 decades, upright from obligation rather than health, his skin pulled too tight over the architecture of a body that has been lending pieces of itself away long enough that the original shape is hard to remember. His hands hold a small glass vessel, one of dozens arranged on the table beside him, and the light inside it moves the way candlelight moves, except there is no candle and the light is the color of old honey and it does not flicker. Behind him, in the doorway, Kofi watches. Kofi is 26, sharp-eyed, newly arrived from the Eastern markets where he has made a modest living finding things that other people undervalue and selling them to people who understand what they are worth. He came to Omu 3 days ago following a rumor. He has been watching the porch every morning since, tallying the math of what he sees, the length of the line, the frequency of the healings, the expressions on the faces of people who leave, and the expression on the face of the man who stays. He has noticed something the villagers, in their gratitude and their need, seem to have stopped noticing years ago. Every time Tony hands a vessel to someone and the light transfers from the glass into the recipient's body, something transfers in the other direction. Color, from Tony's face. Straightness, from Tony's spine. The old man is not conducting the power. He is sourcing it. From himself. Kofi looks at the line of people and sees a queue of customers. He looks at Tony and sees an inventory being depleted. He does not yet understand what it will cost him to be right. The light in the bottle was real. The price of it was realer still. And the young man in the doorway, doing his calculations, had not yet learned that some ledgers, once you put your name in them, cannot be closed. The first person in line that morning was a child. She was perhaps 7, carried on her mother's back the way very sick children are carried, with the mother's body angled slightly forward, redistributing the weight, making herself into a frame so the child doesn't have to spend energy holding herself up. The child's eyes were closed. Her breathing was the shallow, conservative breathing of a body that has learned to ration. Tony watched them come up the path with the expression of a man who has stopped counting individual faces and sees instead the continuous human fact of suffering, its persistence, its variety, its absolute indifference to season or age. He reached for a vessel. His hand trembled as it always did in the mornings, before the work started and the work's particular discipline overrode the body's complaints. The light inside the glass shifted when his fingers closed around it. Responsive. Attuned to him the way an instrument is attuned to the musician who has played it long enough that the music moves between them without conscious effort. He held the vessel to the child's lips. The light entered. The child's breathing changed, deepened, steadied, became the breathing of someone who has been given room. Her eyes opened. She looked at Tony with the uncomplicated wonder of a 7-year-old encountering something she doesn't have language for yet. Tony looked back at her. His left knee buckled. Just slightly, just enough that he had to grip the chair arm, and the grip left white marks in his skin that faded slowly. He did not make a sound. He had learned, decades ago, not to make sounds that would alarm the line. Alarm in the line created questions, and questions created doubt, and doubt was the one thing that the work could not tolerate. The mother pressed coins into his hand. He accepted them because refusal would have taken longer than acceptance, and the line was long, and the morning was moving. In the doorway, Kofi watched the knee buckle. He watched Tony's jaw tighten against the pain. He watched the old man reach for the next vessel with the steady deliberateness of someone performing a calculation, this much given, this much absorbed, and he felt, in the specific part of his mind that had made him useful in the Eastern markets, the first shape of a plan beginning to form. Kofi had not planned to stay in Omu longer than 2 days. He had arrived following the account of a spice merchant who described the village's miracle elder with the qualified skepticism of a man who had seen enough to believe in what he couldn't explain but wasn't prepared to admit it in company. The merchant had shown Kofi a small glass vessel, empty, its light long transferred, and said the glass itself was worth examining if Kofi had the kind of eye for value that he claimed. Kofi had that eye. He had turned it on the village the moment he arrived and found it producing information faster than he could organize. The vessels were everywhere, in homes, hanging from door frames, set on window sills as though the families understood that proximity to the container carried some residual comfort even after the light was gone. People kept them the way people keep relics, not because the power remained but because the object had been present at a moment of grace, and that adjacency felt like it counted for something. And Tony filled new ones every morning. From where, Kofi couldn't yet see. But the rate was consistent, 30 to 40 vessels per morning, each one requiring that specific physical toll, and Kofi had spent his third evening running numbers on a scrap of paper in the guest house, calculating what 30 vessels a day, at the going per-offering rate, would generate in a city market where people paid premium for outcomes they couldn't explain. The calculation produced a number that made him fold the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He needed 2 things, the source, and a way to carry it. The source was somewhere in the shack. He was certain of this because Tony never left it between morning sessions and the next day's dawn, never went to a well, never carried anything back from the forest. Whatever filled the vessels was inside, which meant it was stationary, which meant it was accessible. He needed Tony to trust him enough to let him close. He went to the porch the following morning, not with illness. Tony had a particular attentiveness to people who came without genuine need, Kofi had noticed, but with an offering. Yams from the market. Firewood, bundled. The grammar of a young man making himself useful. Tony looked at him for a long moment. "You are not from here," Tony said. "No, elder." "And you are not sick?" "No, elder." Tony's clouded eyes moved over Kofi's face with an attention that felt, uncomfortably, like being read rather than observed. "Put the wood beside the door," Tony said. "And come back tomorrow." Kofi put the wood beside the door. He came back tomorrow. The woman's name was Adwa, and the thing growing in her body had been there long enough to have a name of its own. The village called it the shadow, which was the Omi word for the kind of illness that moves through a family by reputation, that people lower their voices to discuss. She arrived supported by 2 of her adult sons, and the sons' faces held the specific expression of men who have been told that hope is still possible and aren't sure they believe it anymore but are doing hope's motions anyway, because the alternative is something they are not ready to look at directly. Tony stood for her. He didn't stand for everyone. His niece had specific opinions about standing, but he stood for Adwa, and the standing communicated something the village understood without being told: this one will cost more. He took a vessel from the inner table. Larger than the standard ones. The light inside it was not honey-colored but something deeper, closer to amber, and it moved with more urgency, aware, perhaps, of the size of what it was being asked to address. He placed both hands on Adwa's shoulders. Kofi, who had positioned himself near the corner of the porch on the pretext of stacking the remainder of the wood, watched. The transfer took 4 minutes. He timed it against the sun's movement, which was the only clock available and more reliable than most. During those 4 minutes, Adwa's color changed, the gray undertone of someone whose body is being consumed from within slowly replaced by something that was not exactly health yet but was its predecessor, the physiological state of a body that has just been told it has permission to begin again. Then Tony turned away from her. He made it 3 steps toward the shack door before his body delivered its accounting. He hit the doorframe with one shoulder. He gripped it. His other hand went to his mouth, and what came out of him, into the dirt at the base of the frame, quickly, violently, was black. Not dark red, not the expected colors of illness. Black, the way water is black at depth, the way certain things are black because light does not reach them. He cleaned his mouth with the back of his hand. He steadied himself. He went inside. Adua's sons helped her to the path. She was already walking without their support. No one on the line commented on what Tony had just deposited in the dirt at the base of his doorframe. They had seen it before, Kofi understood. They had seen it and they had fired it in the place where people fire things they need not to think about. He stood at the corner of the porch for a long time after the line resumed. The yams he'd brought were already rotting in the heat. He didn't notice. What Kofi felt in that moment, and what he would spend weeks refusing to name correctly, was not pity, not exactly. It was the specific discomfort of a person who has built an argument on a foundation and has just seen a crack in it. Tony was not hoarding. Tony was hemorrhaging. The plan Kofi had folded in his shirt pocket was based on a misread, and some part of him, the part that had survived 9 years in the Eastern markets by knowing when a deal had a hidden clause, was beginning to understand this. He pushed the feeling down. He was good at pushing things down. But this story is worth staying with, because the feeling had not gone anywhere, it was waiting, the way all suppressed truths wait, for a moment when the defenses were down. Tony showed him on a Thursday, which surprised Kofi because he had been expecting to have to work for it longer. He had been making himself useful for 11 days, wood, water, market runs, the particular invisible labor of someone who wants to be trusted and understands that trust is built through presence before it is built through anything else. Tony had watched all of it with his clouded eyes and said very little, in the way of old men who have learned that silence is the most efficient diagnostic tool available. On Thursday morning, after the line had finished and the porch was empty, Tony said, "Come inside." The interior of the shack was a single room divided by purpose rather than walls. The front half held the table of vessels, a sleeping mat, and the specific austerity of a person who has reduced their possessions to what the work requires. The back half was separated by a curtain of cloth so old it had become semi-transparent with washing. Tony pulled the curtain aside. The basin was carved stone, wide, shallow, set on a low platform once smoothed by decades of hands. The water inside it was not moving, except that it was, in the way that light moves inside a still surface, not displaced but present, as though the water was a medium for something that would be visible from the right angle. It was the color of the vessels. Honey amber. And warm, Kofi felt the warmth from 3 steps away, which was not how water behaved. "You have been wondering," Tony said. It was not a question. "Yes, Elder. Everyone wonders." The villagers stopped looking because looking requires acknowledging what they see. Tony lowered himself onto a small stool beside the basin with the careful economy of someone for whom sitting down is a project. "You look, though. You have been looking since the first morning." Kofi said nothing. The basin's light was reflected in his eyes. "Do you know why I showed you?" Tony asked. "No, Elder." Tony looked at the water for a moment. "Because the man who comes to take something always arrives eventually. I have found it is better to show him the door than to make him look for it. Thieves who search cause more damage than thieves who are given a key." The word thief arrived in the room with a weight Kofi did not fully absorb. "I'm not here to." "Go home," Tony said. Not unkindly. "Sleep. Come back tomorrow if you choose." He pulled the curtain closed. Kofi went home. He did not sleep. He lay on the guest house mat and stared at the ceiling and thought about the warmth he had felt from 3 steps away, and the plan in his shirt pocket, and the black in the dirt at the base of the doorframe. He came back the next day. The demand arrived in the form of a delegation. 7 men, elders of various standing, farmers mostly, wearing the expressions of people who have prepared what they intend to say and are committed to saying it regardless of the response. They came on a market day, which meant Tony had already done a full morning's work and was sitting in his chair in the particular stillness of someone whose body is conserving everything it has left. Kofi was near the woodpile. He stayed. The delegation spokesman was a man named Asante, who had a voice that projected naturally and used it as a tool without appearing to. The rainy season was late. The eastern fields were cracking. The river that fed the lower farms was running half its usual depth, and 2 families had already lost their planting. They needed a rain miracle. Tony listened. His hands were folded in his lap, and Kofi had learned to read Tony's hands. Folded meant the body was resting, saving, not engaged in the automatic hopefulness that open palms expressed. A rain working is not like a healing, Tony said. A healing takes from the person in front of me. Rain takes from the sky, which means the sky takes from somewhere else, which means the balance must be paid from. Elder. Asante's voice was patient but firm in the way of a man who has prepared for objections. The village depends on those fields. I know. Then you know we cannot wait for the natural season. I know that too. The delegation waited. Tony looked at his folded hands for a moment that was long enough to be a kind of grief. Come back at sunset, he said. The delegation left. Kofi watched them go, the unhurried walk of men who expect to get what they came for, who have spent decades treating Tony's porch as a service counter, who have never once, in Kofi's 11 days of observation, asked the old man how his legs were feeling or why his hands trembled at specific temperatures or what it cost him to get out of the chair each morning. He had a thought that surprised him by arriving in the emotional register rather than the analytical one. They do not see him as a person. They see him as a function. He turned this thought over carefully. It had implications for his plan that he was not ready to examine. At sunset, it rained. Tony did not appear on the porch the following morning. A note on the door said, "Come back in 2 days." The village complained about the wait. The omen came without announcement, which is how real omens arrive, not preceded by trumpets but by a particular quality of silence, a change in atmospheric pressure, the behavior of birds. The birds of Omu went quiet on the afternoon of the 14th day of Kofi's stay. Not the gradual quieting of dusk, but an immediate cessation, as though something had broadcast a frequency that only the birds received and they had agreed, collectively and without debate, to respond to it by going still. The moon that rose that night was the color of clay-stained water. Kofi stood outside the guest house and looked at it with the feeling of a man who has grown up in places that have their own relationship with sky signs and who has trained himself out of that relationship in the interest of appearing modern and is now discovering that the training was cosmetic. He went to the shack. Tony was outside, which was unusual for this hour. He was standing, not leaning on the doorframe, actually standing with his full weight, looking at the moon with an expression Kofi had not seen on him before. Not serenity, not exhaustion. Something closer to recognition. You know what it means, Kofi said. Yes. What does it mean? Tony was quiet for a moment. The moon's light hit his face and made his skin look like carved wood, ancient, structural, something that had been shaped by decades of specific pressure into a specific form. It means the balance is calling for a transfer, Tony said. The weight I carry has a limit. Everything has a limit. He paused. The last blood moon in Omu came 50 years ago. I was much younger then. I stood in a place I should not have stood, touched a thing I should not have touched, and became something I did not plan to become. He looked at Kofi directly. The moon doesn't care about plans, he said. It cares about weight. And the weight needs a new place to land. Kofi held the old man's gaze. How long? 3 days, Tony said. Possibly less. He went inside. Kofi stood under the blood moon for a long time. The plan in his shirt pocket had undergone, in the past 2 weeks, several revisions that he had not permitted himself to fully acknowledge. What he was planning to do and why he was planning to do it had become, somewhere in the interval between the delegation and the blood moon, more complicated than profit. He went inside and did not sleep. He went at midnight, which was the hour he had always intended, though the reasons had shifted. The shack door was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, expecting resistance, alarm, confrontation, something. The door swung wide and easy and the room beyond it was lit only by the basin's glow, which was lower than he'd seen it. Diminished. Pulling at its own resources. Tony was on the floor. Not fallen, placed, or lowered, the way very sick people arrange themselves because the floor is the only surface that requires nothing of them. He was on his back, his chest rising and falling with the shallow irregularity of someone whose body is running a negotiation between function and failure. His eyes were open. They found Kofi immediately. Tony raised one hand. The gesture was not threatening. It was something between a warning and a welcome, the hand of a man who has been expecting this visitor and has already decided how to receive him. Elder, Kofi started. Tony shook his head once. Conserving air for what mattered. Kofi looked at the curtain. At the warm glow pushing through the old cloth. He looked at Tony on the floor, and at the vessels on the table, and at the life the old man had been living in this room, the mat, the curtain, the single cooking pot, the absence of anything that was not the work. He pulled the curtain aside. The basin's surface was moving now, agitated in a way it hadn't been when Tony showed it to him, as though it could sense proximity and was responding to it. The warmth hit him full in the chest. He thought of the delegation. Of the rain miracle. Of Tony writing the note, "Come back in 2 days." He thought of Adwa's sons. He thought of the blood moon. He put his hands into the water. It did not begin as pain. It began as information, a vast, simultaneous transmission of every experience the water carried, arriving not sequentially but all at once, the way a chord arrives, multiple notes, a single moment. Kofi's body received it the way a cup receives an ocean, which is to say, inadequately, with immediate structural consequences. The fever came first. Not one fever, every fever Tony had absorbed in 50 years, stacked and simultaneous, the body temperature of 100 sick people running through Kofi's blood at the same time. He heard himself make a sound he didn't recognize as his own voice. Then the bone aches. Then something he could only identify as grief, not his grief, not anything with a specific object, but the accumulated sorrowful weight of 50 years of human suffering taken in and held, the emotional residue of every pain that had been redirected from its original location into the body of one old man who had decided, for reasons Kofi didn't yet know, to say give it to me. The room did something to the light. Or the light did something to the room. The distinction stopped mattering when the faces appeared. Not frightening faces. Faces of people, the faces of people who had been healed, their expressions at the moment the miracle transferred, all of them present simultaneously in a space that should not have been large enough to hold one person's lifetime, let alone hundreds. Kofi went to his knees in the water. The basin's light was inside him now, not warm but blazing, the temperature of consequence rather than comfort, and he understood, with the specific clarity of a man whose every defense has been burned away by something his defenses were not designed to handle, that he had misread the inventory entirely. There was no supply to sell. There was only death. 50 years of redirected agony, carefully maintained, the interest paid daily from the body of a man who had chosen it and kept choosing it, morning after morning, vessel after vessel, knee buckling in the doorframe, black in the dirt. He couldn't breathe. A hand on his shoulder. Dry, light, steady. Tony crouched beside him, or the shape of Tony, because the man who lowered himself beside the basin moved without the careful economy of the old man on the floor. He moved with the ease of someone who has just had a very heavy thing lifted. Breathe, Tony said. You will not die from this. But you need to understand what you have taken before we speak. Kofi breathed. This is the moment everything changes, not just for Kofi, but for what we thought we understood about Tony. There is a man who spends 50 years absorbing the world's pain in a crumbling shack, alone, with no one to share even the knowledge of what he was doing. Sit with that. Some sacrifices are never witnessed. This story is for the ones that should have been. If it's reached you, share it, because some truths need more than one set of ears. Tony sat on the low platform beside the empty basin. Not the Tony who had been on the floor, this was different, the difference legible in the way he occupied his own body. Upright without effort. Eyes clear, the cataracts gone as though they had been a costume worn for a specific performance that had now ended. He looked, in the amber light of the room, like a man of middle years who has recently slept well for the first time in a very long time. Kofi sat in the water with the weight of 50 years in his chest and waited. I was not good, Tony said. The opening was so unadorned that it took Kofi a moment to understand it was a beginning. I want you to know that before I explain anything else. The village remembers me as the elder. They don't remember what I was at 23, which was a thief, specifically, the thief who came to the shack of the old healer, 50 years ago, and did what you just did. Kofi looked up. His name was Mensa, Tony said. He was older than I am now. Older and further along in his penance than he knew. When I pushed him aside to reach the basin, he fell. And he did not get up. A pause. I have never been certain whether he died from the fall or from the sudden unburdening, from the weight lifting all at once, faster than an old body could manage. The distinction has mattered to me for 50 years. Penance, Kofi said. His voice sounded wrong, too much resonance, as though the basin's acoustics had transferred with everything else. Every miracle is a redirection, Tony said. The suffering doesn't disappear. It moves. The fever goes from the child's body to mine. The cancer goes from hardware to a place inside me where the basin manages it, stores it, distributes it across time so I don't receive it all at once. He looked at his hands, smooth now, the tremor gone. The basin isn't the source. It's the management system. The source is the vessel who agrees to carry the load. You didn't agree, Kofi said. Not initially. But I chose to stay. Every morning I sat in that chair, I chose again. He met Kofi's eyes. As you chose when you put your hands in. I didn't know what I was choosing. Mensa tried to warn me, Tony said simply. I didn't listen either. The room was quiet. Outside, the blood moon was descending. The penance had a term, Tony said. Not a number of years, a condition. It ends when the debt is accepted willingly by another. The willingness is the key. Not theft. Not accident. He looked at Kofi steadily. You came back every day for 2 weeks. You watched. You stayed when you could have left. When you reached into that basin, it wasn't only greed. Some part of you had already decided that the weight should not stay with one old man indefinitely. Kofi did not confirm this. He didn't need to. That part, Tony said, was enough. He stood. He was light on his feet in a way that made Kofi want to look away from, not from cruelty but from the rawness of watching a person discover, for the first time in 50 years, that their body belongs to them again. There are things you need to know, Tony said. About the morning sessions. About the basin's limits. About what the weight would do to you if you tried to hold it without distributing it properly. He paused. I will tell you everything Mensa tried to tell me and I did not hear. You will hear it, because you are already carrying it, and understanding is the only thing that makes carrying bearable. He talked until the moon was gone and the first light was beginning. Tony left at dawn, without ceremony, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. He stood at the door of the shack for a moment, not looking back at it, looking at the path that led through the village and out toward the forest on the eastern side, the path he had not taken freely in 50 years. His body was the body of a man in his mid-20s, which was the body he had occupied when he first arrived at the previous elder's door. The village, when it woke, would not recognize him. This was correct. This was clean. Kofi sat in the wooden chair on the porch. The table of vessels was beside him, refilled during the long night of Tony's final instructions, each one carrying a portion of what the basin now held, and Kofi's body was learning, painfully and precisely, to manage. Tony had been thorough. Tony had told him everything, in the flat, comprehensive manner of a man who has been waiting to give this particular briefing for a very long time and is determined to leave nothing out. The sun crested the baobab line. Kofi looked at his hands. They were already different, not visibly, not yet, but he could feel the basin in them, the responsiveness, the way the light inside the vessels nearest to him shifted fractionally toward his presence, the way a compass needle shifts toward north. He was the north now. He had not asked to be north. He was north regardless. He thought about the plan that had been in his shirt pocket. He thought about the number on the folded paper, the Eastern market, the simple arithmetic of undervalued things and the people who would pay correctly for them. He thought about Adua's sons. He thought about Tony's hands around the vessel, trembling, choosing again. He did not know yet what kind of man he was going to be in this chair. He suspected the chair would determine a great deal of that over time, the way any position of sustained responsibility shapes the person who holds it, slowly, permanently, in directions they couldn't have predicted from the outside. The birds came back first. Then the mist over the lower fields began to move. Then the first figure appeared at the edge of the forest path, walking toward the porch with the particular gait of someone who has made a decision they are committed to and is covering the distance as directly as possible. The knock came before Kofi was ready. He was not sure he would ever be ready. He suspected that was also irrelevant. "Elder," said a voice through the door. A woman's voice, high and tight with the specific tension of someone holding themselves together through an act of sustained will. "Elder, please. My son is burning." Kofi looked at the vessels. At the light inside them, steady and waiting. At the porch, and the path, and the baobab trees catching the first copper of the morning. He stood. He opened the door. Tony walked into the forest and did not look back. And this is how certain kinds of freedom arrive, not as celebration but as permission, a door opened by someone else's choice, a debt retired by an inheritance no one advertised. And Kofi sat in a chair he hadn't planned to sit in a village he'd arrived at by rumor, holding a weight he'd reached for with the wrong intentions and received with something closer to the right ones. Some stories don't end where you expect them to. They end where they were always going. If this one stayed with you, if it said something about what we carry and why and for whom, subscribe and stay. There are more stories like this one waiting, and they all deserve to be heard.